Hello and welcome to All the Games You Like Are Bad. I'm your dog of Kulan, Mark Bigney, and today we're going to be talking about Innis by Christian Martinez. First off, I'm going to say Innis rather than Enos, so as to avoid any sort of Wiener-related allusions. And by Wiener, I obviously mean Anthony Weiner, disgraced former congressman, former mayoral candidate, and a man whose douchebaggery is so potent he can ruin any number of political careers all at once. Man, what an Enos that guy is. Anyway, talking about Innis, let's start with what it isn't. Innis is not Cyclades, and it's not Kemet. I don't understand why people insist on comparing games by the same publisher which happen to share the same box size, and automatically starting from that point of comparison. They share very, very little in common, other than they have little plastic guys standing on maps. But that doesn't get you very far in terms of describing what a game is like, and they're all radically different games, so the less said about Cyclades and Kemet, the better. Let me start by telling you about my experience with the game. So, as a young boy growing up in 1910 Prince Edward Island, let's cut to the chase. As an old boy growing up, never mind. Look, I'm standing right here. Okay, so I played it once and I hated it. I thought it was a nonsensical game of stupidity and randomness, but after having played it the once, as time went on, I started thinking back on the game, and I started becoming more intrigued by what were perhaps the tactical and strategic possibilities offered by the game system. So despite having hated my first play, I wanted to play again, which is somewhat unusual for me. And then I played it again, and the stupidity kind of receded. And I kept playing it, and the stupidity receded. But then at a certain point, I reached a tipping point, and then the stupidity started coming back. Because once I got familiarity with the core game systems, I appreciated the core game systems as being really, really, really good. But a lot of the other things introduced into the system started rearing their ugly heads, undermining the strength of the core game systems. I'm going to be repeating this as a general theme as I go through the specific details, but it's worth noting that this experience that I had of having a very disappointing first play, being intrigued in subsequent plays, but then eventually reaching the conclusion that the game wasn't shining to its full potential, has been shared by a number of my other friends. Indeed, some of the early reports from people at Gen Con, after having played it once, was, it's not a good game. But then later on in the con, they're like, I want to try it again. So, Innis is a drafting game. And to a certain extent, card drafting is kind of like the new auction, because it can be a good mechanic, and you can make lots and lots of good games off of this mechanic, or including this mechanic, but it can also be used as a crutch. Auctions for a long time were sort of the default Eurogame style, and for a long time you couldn't encounter a game without some element of auctioning in it. Because when you introduce an auction element, you don't need to balance things as tightly as they do. You let the players balance things for you. Drafting can be the same way. You have a whole bunch of cards, you don't really need to balance them as tightly as you would need to normally, or distribute them in a clever game mechanic way if you just do it with a draft. So I'm a little bit hesitant about drafting games generally because I want to see if they've done something interesting with it. Pure drafting games can be fun. My favorite is Fairy Tale, because it includes the three things that I want a drafting game to be able to include. One of them is hate drafting, being able to draft a card so as to deny it from somebody else. I like it when a game system allows for that possibility and doesn't make it punitively expensive for you to do that as a player. Another thing that Fairy Tale has is it's easy to parse what everyone else at the table wants and needs, which feeds into the ease of hate drafting. And the final thing that Fairy Tale does, which I like drafting games to do, is it allows you to adapt your strategy mid-game. The way that it structures the rounds and the way that it structures the drafting more generally means that if you don't get what you want or what you need, you can change course and you won't be penalized overly harshly. I love Fairy Tale. It's great. I've played it tons and tons and tons of times. I like it so much, actually, that lots of other pure drafting games have left me crushingly disappointed because what they add in complexity, I don't find any payoff, and sometimes they don't do the things that Fairy Tale does allow in a drafting game. An example of this is Seven Wonders. I don't like Seven Wonders. I don't think that the added rule systems add any depth of strategic decision-making. I don't think that the added length contributes to any degree of quality to the game, and to a large extent, the things that it does well, Fairy Tale does better. Sometimes pure drafting games for me can be a bit of a miss, in part because I think Fairy Tale is so successful at what it does. Similarly, games like Blood Rage. Blood Rage is also a drafting game, and I love Blood Rage, but let's be honest, let us speak as adults here. The drafting in Blood Rage is not super awesome. It's not the best element of the game. The drafting is actually relatively straightforward. You just look at your hand, you figure which one works best for me, pass the rest on. You don't really worry about hate drafting too much, I mean sometimes, but the opportunity cost of taking a card from somebody just because it's what they want, when there's another card in the hand that you desperately need, is so high that you're just better off playing to your own strengths. A lot of these interesting decisions come from actually playing the table, which is fine. That's fine. But quad drafting game, I don't like Blood Rage all that much. Compare that to Midgard. Look, I am a hipster of Eric Lang. I was into Eric Lang before it was cool. I really liked Midgard as a design. I prefer Blood Rage, but Midgard had a number of strengths that Blood Rage doesn't. For example, in Midgard, the attacks, where a region will be attacked and how it will be reinforced, are determined by the cards specifically. So you can look at the cards during the drafting phase and get a sense of what is going to happen later on during the action phase. And if you need to protect a certain region against attack, just take those cards out from the pack and you can defend yourself that way. You can't do those kinds of things in Blood Rage, so there's no interconnectedness between the action phase and the drafting phase in the way that Midgard had, and that is one element that I miss. So, Innis. Innis is more like Midgard in the sense that the actions are determined purely by the draft. They're not tied to regions the way that Midgard was, but by looking at your hand of cards, and by looking at what's available, and by remembering what you're passing to your opponents, you get a better sense of what they'll be able to do, and you have a good sense of how they'll be able to direct their action phase. Unlike in a game of Blood Rage, for example, because again, the actions are not connected to the cards that you've been drafted. If you know the card set, you can exert considerable control over the game state and get considerable foreknowledge of the game state based on the drafting phase. Now, this is one of the reasons why your first play is apt to be a disorienting and random feeling experience. You don't know the card set. Each card is unique, and knowing how many attacks there are in the action set, how many reinforcement actions there are in the total set is super important, because getting guys on the map and knowing when attacks will come is incredibly crucial. And I've tried a number of different ways to explain the game. Highlighting which cards start attacks is helpful for first-time players, but it's still going to be a semi-random, chaotic experience for someone on their first play. Subsequent plays, however, really allows the depth of the drafting system to speak to the quality of the game. You have this tight element of all the actions being parsed out by the drafting system, and that's how you control what's going to happen in the subsequent round. It's great, it's delicious, it's marvelous, more on all that later. You can draft a combo, you can draft to build a strategy for future rounds, you can draft to undercut an opponent's strategy, because if you know that they desperately need to attack and keep the attack card for yourself, you can still use that to attack for yourself, and generally speaking, you'll have a chance to do that. There's lots of interesting counterplays and doublethink. It's really well done in the sense of the drafting. Another virtue that Innis has is that it is really quick. A game with experienced players can be 30 to 45 minutes, no joke, and you get a sort of reasonably complete dudes in a map experience if that's what you're looking for. I don't really think that it's useful to compare it to other dudes in a map game because it's the figure count is relatively low and you're not going to have a huge number of conflicts, but it's a very, very satisfying experience considering the amount of time that you have to play. It's also the case that the cards are utterly drop-dead gorgeous. Each card has a unique piece of art, of which there are dozens and dozens, and they're absolutely beautiful, and they're done by an artist named Jim Fitzpatrick. He's well known for his Celtic art, and it's really, really compelling and really unique. It looks different from most of the other games out here. It doesn't have the generic sort of fantasy style or the generic sort of mythological style. It's its own beast. So that's the good stuff about Innis. But, and it's a big set of buts. I like big butts. Shut up, I don't need your help. Alright, so just continuing on this theme of the components, the tiles. I don't like the tiles aesthetically. I mean, for one thing, they just don't match the style of the cards. Some people really like the tiles, some people aren't bothered by the fact that the tiles don't really match the cards. Whatever, that's up to you, you can take a look. The crinkly edges don't do anything for me. The solid white border, I just think it looks kind of weird. So let's talk about the elements of game design that I think are really quite bad about Innis, and these are some of the reasons why I didn't like it on the first play, and I thought the game was really badly done. The battles are purely attritional. When a fight starts between two players, and it's usually primarily between two players, although sometimes other people get involved, it's just a question of I whack you upside the head and I sap your strength on the board. Now, when the battle system really works at its best. Battles are ad hoc. You move in for a specific reason, you do one specific thing, maybe your opponent does one specific thing, and then usually it's over, you decide to call it off and stop the fight, and then everything's fine, you got what you wanted, maybe they only got cost a little bit, you both bled a little, everything's fine. And these do happen. In most games, you will see these battles and they work fine. But the problem is you take one step past those parameters and things can go off the rails real hard, and it's attritional combat at its worst. What do I mean by this? Well, in most games that I've played, and certainly every game with new players, you end up in a situation where there's an incredibly grueling fight where, for reasons past understanding and impossible to predict, it turns out you end up in a quagmire of attrition with somebody else, and you lose possibly your entire hand for the round and many of your figures. And guess what? Your board position is crippled, possibly permanently, possibly past the point of no return, and your round is ruined because whatever cards you drafted are gone, or maybe you drafted for a combo, and the card you needed to pull that combo off is gone. Either it was because it was stolen randomly, due to weird battle effects, or because your opponent didn't react the way you anticipated them to do. Sometimes this is your fault. Sometimes you end up in a quagmire because you're an idiot. But if you're the idiot that introduces a quagmire to another player, and they didn't do anything to provoke that, and they get caught in the quagmire too, well then guess what? Somebody throws the game. They upset the board position because they don't know what they're doing. And the battle system really, really encourages mistakes leading to the game spiraling out of control. In a 3-player game or a 4-player game, if 2 people are caught in a dumb fight, and it could be dumb just because one person decides to be dumb, or because someone couldn't foresee a secret, weird, random card that they had hidden up their back pocket, you just get to watch them destroy each other and laugh, knowing that you're going to be the beneficiary of that. That is bad design. It is bad design to allow for these bad decisions, and it's even worse design when it allows for even smart people to get caught in these terrible situations. Attritional battle systems should be avoided wherever possible, and when they exist, you should always make sure that the attrition is localized. In Innis, neither of these two things are true. The attrition actually is not even just localized to an area with a small amount of guys, but it can bleed out all the cards for your hand, meaning that you basically get to sit out the round. It's worse than lose a turn. It's all your plans for the entire round gone. You just get to sit and watch other people do things. It's really unfortunate, and there are not enough ways to counter that, especially with new players. It's also the case that the way that it deals with the start player is weird and unfortunate. The start player is called the Bren, and at the start of the game you randomly determine a Bren. And if the Bren wants to stay the Bren for the entire game, they can usually do so with very little difficulty. The way that it works is the only way you can take Bren from somebody else is by getting more figures than them in the capital. But the Bren decides where the capital is. The Bren places first, and they can set up in the capital and put all their guys there, and it's not even necessarily unintelligent to do that, and they can be the Bren for the entire game. Now, sometimes that's a bad call, but Bren breaks ties in terms of determining victory, and in this game, the victory conditions are very parsimonious. You're going to get to 1 victory condition, maybe 2, and if the Bren is one of the people who gets to one of the victory condition, they just win outright. They break ties. So that's kind of unfortunate often. It's not always the Bren is not always consequential, but when the Bren is consequential, it's hugely consequential. Now, a way to self-balance this that we've been doing in our plays is the Bren, when they're randomly determined at the start of the game and they decide where the capital is, and the capital determines who the Bren is going forward, they deliberately pick a region that's kind of weak. So the region itself isn't super valuable. So if the Bren wants to stay Bren, they do so by piling resources into a region that's not particularly advantageous. If you have somebody that isn't interested in preserving, a sort of quality game state, and they pick a region that's really easy to defend, like the mountains or the iron mine, it leads to an unfortunate game situation. So the way the Bren works, not super awesome. Some of the cards are also kind of dumb. There's the pull a card from the discard card, which is kind of weak design. There's the draw 3 cards, pick 1 card, which is super lazy design. And some of the other cards are all over the place. A lot of the game is determined by these red cards. At the start of each round, you draft green cards, and they're the core action cards that are part of the game, and that's the super tight, super predictable, interesting bit. And then there are all these red cards. Some are incredibly situational, some are relatively weak, some, on the other hand, are of relatively broad application and really powerful. And what they do is they upset all that deterministic loveliness that the green cards introduce. So at the start of the round, you have control over how the actions are going to be parsed out, but on top of that, you have no idea what red cards might do to upset that game state. And so you don't really get the strength of a very calculational, deterministic action round by virtue of the fact that the red cards can upset this. But by the same token, you don't have a wild and crazy freewheeling take that game because green cards do determine a lot of the action. So you don't really get the strengths of either of those systems. It's also the case that the territories, the different terrains that come out, are pulled randomly, and some of them are borderline useless, and some of them are incredibly kick-ass amazing. And there's very little mobility in this game. So if somebody pulls a really, really awesome terrain tile, they might just be sitting on it for several rounds because there's not much you can do to go after and get them. The net effect of this, overall, is a game that's really good and really fun, but also has really terrible design elements. And sometimes your sessions are going to be determined, or at least upset, by wild and crazy wackiness that no one could really see coming. That's a really strange marriage. And it's a testament to the strength of those core elements of the drafting element and the way that that influences the action round that I still do enjoy playing the game, even though every time I play the game, the way the Bren works annoys the hell out of me. The way the terrain tiles can be so disproportionately powered annoys the hell out of me. The way red cards can just introduce random nonsense really bothers me. So I'm really conflicted about this design. The analogy that I give is that it's kind of like playing a game like Antica, a very deterministic, no-luck, plodding, sequential game of efficiency, and introducing some of the take-that cards of Cosmic Encounter, where you play a card and something wild and unforeseen happens. That's not a good mix. That element of the mixture is my least favorite part of Innis, and it's one of the reasons why I think the actual design of the game is very problematic. And so I wish I could recommend this unreservedly. What I can tell you is the following. If you have a chance to play it, give it a shot. You're not going to give up much of your life, 45 to 60 minutes. And don't let your initial impressions determine your impression of the game. Spend some time thinking about it. Consider the matter. Play twice if at all possible. Because if you're anything like me, your first play is going to be a disastrously unpleasant experience. But as you consider the strategic possibilities of the drafting, you might start to see some of its virtues. And then maybe you might want to get out before, your fifth or sixth or seventh play, so that the red cards don't completely spoil your enjoyment of the game. I realize that this is an awfully nuanced and conditional and equivocal kind of analysis of the game. A game that I think is badly designed in a lot of ways, and its bad design undercuts the elements of its good design, but I still enjoy playing it from time to time. To a certain extent, I guess you could say it's like a guilty pleasure, although usually guilty pleasures are driven by theme. This is a guilty pleasure that is driven by good design married to really bad design. If that's a level of ambiguity you can't take, well then you're wrong, but I forgive you. Thanks very much, and take care.